What was your first reaction when you first heard the news?
There's so many art thefts, and I always get called to do interviews, and I had like 47 interview requests within a few minutes. What was interesting for me first is that it's not an art theft per se because we're dealing with the jewelry.
Let's talk about what happened that day. So from what I understand, the value of the heist is about $100 million. That's excluding the historical value, which makes it priceless.
Immediately, it suggests that these are members of an organized crime group who have no experience stealing from museums. It feels like the movies have come to real life.
I'm a fan of Ocean's 11, 12, and 13 as well. Exactly. I'm a fan of Ocean's movies. So this is I can't wait for this story to continue developing.
Yeah, it's a real life version of it. Absolutely. They happen just enough that it feels like the movies have come to real life.
Yeah. And what was your first reaction when you first heard the news?
So my first reaction, there's so many art thefts, and I always get called to do interviews. And sometimes I don't have time to follow them all. So my mom sent me a WhatsApp message saying, you probably already know about this, but, and then I hopped on, and of course, and I had like 47 interview requests within a few minutes. But what was interesting for me first is that it's not an art theft per se because we're dealing with the jewelry. And one of the things we can talk about is how jewelry theft is actually quite different from the theft of fine art, talking about the difference between intrinsic and non-intrinsic value of the object in question. So I knew this was going to be a different sort of subcategory of what I'm normally teaching.
Yeah, exactly. And we can continue the discussion now since we already jumped into it. Because
sure,
when it's jewelry, you could dismantle it, and it's much easier to sell on the black market if it's a high-profile theft. If they stole the Mona Lisa like they did in 1911, it's back then was a different. Mona Lisa wasn't as popular. But if they steal it today, it's almost impossible to sell in the black market because anyone that buys it cannot display it, because if he's reported, he loses the artwork.
That's exactly right. So if we're dealing with a fine work of art like the Mona Lisa, it has a very high non-intrinsic value that's based on culture and history. And if you break down the component parts of it, it's, wood or canvas and pigment. You can't break it up and sell the component ingredients. And so you're absolutely right. Anyone who wants to know that it's been stolen can find out easily. There's a question of whether people want to know or if they actually want to find a good deal. But it is very, very hard to profit from stolen art. And in fact, it's so hard that if criminals knew how difficult it was, they probably wouldn't bother. Fiction and film makes people think that it's, it's quite easy to do and that there are these criminal collectors out there, but essentially they haven't existed in recorded history. I can think of a few dozen we know of through all of recorded history, but that's what tends to be written about in novels. We see that in the movies. So that's the base of knowledge for most criminals. They're watching Ocean's 11 too. They're, watching TV series about art theft, Red Notice with Dwayne Johnson, and they think, okay, this is how it works. And unfortunately, it's not so hard to steal works of art, but it's really hard to profit from them. Jewelry, on the other hand, that's a different story. It's much easier.
Let's talk about what happened that day. So from what I understand, the value of the heist is about $100 million. That's excluding the historical value, which makes it priceless. But just the jewelry itself, just over $100 million. They stole a crown, necklace, tiara, all related to Napoleon and people around him, his family or loved ones. So from what I understand, early morning, about 9:30 a.m., two gentlemen stole a pickup truck, a cherry picker, drove it to because there's construction in that area, drove it to the Louvre, to an area that's near the construction zone. And then they just went up the electric ladder, used the cutting disc to cut through the window, walked in, used the cutting disc to cut through the protective glass. They were wearing like a construction jersey, balaclavas. They cut through it, and then they threatened the security with it because security came because the alarm did ring. They threatened the security with it, took the jewelry, took them about 3 minutes, 7 minutes total, 3 minutes for the burglary, 4 minutes for going in and out, and they left. That's from what I understand. Does that look like, first, did I get it all right? And second, does that seem like professionals to you? Because they did drop a lot of things. They dropped their gloves. They couldn't blow out. They tried to burn the cherry picker. They couldn't. They dropped the crown that they stole. They left their I think, some fuel. So they left some protective the jerseys, I think they left the jerseys as well. Does that look like professionals to you?
So it's a really good question. Immediately, it suggests that these are members of an organized crime group who have no experience stealing from museums. Why do I think that? Well, the vast majority of art crime involves organized crime at some point in the life of the crime. That could mean that they're the ones doing the stealing, or they're fencing or smuggling, or they're effectively commissioning the crime. We're going to leave aside the idea that there's a collector who wants the piece in the end, because that almost never happens. We'll put that aside for now.
Okay.
Organized crime groups are behind most antiquities looting and art theft. And organized crime is kind of a broad definition if we're speaking criminologically. It's any group of 3 or more individuals involved in a variety of criminal enterprises for collective long-term goals. Now, that sounds very fancy for me to define it, but it basically means an individual or a couple of people or a group of people who are in it to make as much money as possible really quickly don't qualify because they don't have this hierarchical structure. They don't have people they're answering to higher up the chain, and they're more like free agents. So it suggests to me that these are members of some criminal group, but they've never been involved in this sort of theft before. And I'm also not surprised about that, because it almost has never existed in history that there's such a thing as a professional art thief. There are some thieves who thought it sounded quite sexy to call themselves art thieves, because it does have this cachet to it. And there have been thieves like Stefan Breitweiser, a Swiss waiter, who stole over 300 paintings, but never sold any of them. And so he was a compulsive thief. He had suffered from kleptomania that focused on artworks. But the idea that there are teams of thieves stealing art regularly is largely the realm of fiction. So I think these are criminals who did a pretty good job, all things considered. It was very well conceived of, the crime, and it was carried out about as you'd expect. You'd expect things to go badly. It's a comedy of errors. When you're trying to extract something from an extremely well-secured location, bad things can happen. And so, all things considered, if I'm allowed to say this, they did pretty well. Not that I'm condoning it, but if I were giving them a grade as their criminal boss, they did pretty well with this.
Because what I missed is there were 4 of them. 2 went up, stole the jewelry, went down, and 2 were waiting on a motorbike to drive them away. Do you think there's other accomplices as well for such an operation? Because the more people there is, obviously, the more minds involved. But if I go back to the movie Goodfellas, the more likely someone's going to make a mistake. Do you think there were more accomplices?
Yeah, there certainly would have been behind the scenes. If it's just the 4 of them, then the question is, what do they do with the jewels once they've escaped? And they have to have had a plan in mind, and the duration of time after an art theft. But before we hear anything from the criminals can tell us what their intentions were. So if there are, let's first talk about paintings and sculptures rather than jewelry, because jewelry has another potential destination that we'll come back to. If we're dealing with a painting, Mona Lisa, for example, if very quickly a ransom demand is made, it means that ransom was plan A. And if nobody pays the ransom, then the criminals are in big trouble because they don't have a plan B. A plan B essentially doesn't exist. If a couple of weeks go by and then a ransom demand comes in, it means that plan A was finding a buyer and they couldn't find one, so ransoming was plan B. And then if you don't pay the ransom, they're also in trouble. And historically, we know that there's a likelihood that they'll simply abandon the stolen art when they realize they aren't going to be able to find someone to buy it. Now, if there is no contact at all from the criminals, then it likely means that they either had a buyer lined up or that the stolen goods acted as collateral or have been absorbed into a barter system between organized criminal groups. And it works like this. So after a 9/11, we had this run of criminal groups and terrorist groups trying to shift gears because they understood that police and governments were following trails of money passing through different hands. And if you don't send somebody money, then it was much harder for anyone to track you. So what you'd have happen is the exchange of illicit goods of equal value between members of organized crime groups in different places. So someone in Turkey, for example, might swap a stolen painting for a shipment of cocaine. And at the same time, his colleagues in Sweden might swap another stolen painting for, a box of AK-47, something like this. And the idea is that each of these objects, there's a risk in trying to turn it into cash. But if you don't try to turn it into cash, it acts like a check that has value, but you're never going to try to cash it, because that's the moment when you're most likely to be caught. So this is what may happen with fine works of art. But now let's get to what happens with jewelry, because it's much more problematic. So with jewelry, the issue is it has a very high intrinsic value, meaning that the object itself, if you break it down into its ingredients, is still incredibly valuable. Now, you mentioned that there's an estimated value of $100 million or something. Estimated values are mostly made up. There, you can have a best guess. It's worth a lot of money, but until something comes to auction on the open market with no question marks behind it, you have no idea. So, okay, let's say it's 100 million. Then the estimated value that's easier to calculate is what if all of these gems were disassembled from the jewelry and recut so they're no longer identifiable as having come from the stolen jewelry. It still has a value, and that's easier to estimate. That's about 10% of its theoretical value as a cultural heritage object. That means you can still get 10 million from it. And if I'm the criminal, I'm not thinking, oh man, this is worth 100 million, I'm only getting 10. I'm thinking, oh man, I worked for one day and I made 10 million. And they have no interest, I'm sure, in the cultural heritage, or if they're smart, they wouldn't even bother trying to find a buyer. Unfortunately, it would have been cut up and recut, broken up within a couple hours of the theft.
I thought the 100 million was the value of just the jewelry that they stole, excluding the cultural heritage. That's what I understood, but I could be wrong.
We may have different sources. Mine said that the estimated value in US dollars was 88 million for all of the pieces intact because of the cultural heritage value. And the street value for selling them as gems was around 8 to 10 million. But, because these estimates are pretty arbitrary depending on who you ask, I'm not surprised if we heard different numbers.
Going back to what the thieves would do now. So they've stolen the jewelry. They somehow escaped. How could they escape if they're sitting on scooters? They're in Paris, and there's cameras everywhere, CCTV footage, and now with AI, shouldn't it be pretty easy to follow them through? And I'm just trying to see, how could they avoid cameras? Eventually, the cameras will follow them to a certain destination, and then using AI, they'd know their height, their width, their shoulder height. Technology has gotten to a level where, in my mind, thefts like this are almost impossible. Then I found out they happen on a regular basis, almost weekly basis. There's been like 3 in the last 2 months in France alone. I was researching that earlier. So it was pretty mind-boggling. But how is that possible with today's technology?
Well, it's a good question, and the level of high-tech security surveillance footage that's available, I'm not honestly sure about. I do know that what covers the outside of the Louvre and the inside was not sufficient to identify anyone, and it didn't cover enough angles. So that's an issue with whatever the firm was that installed the security surveillance equipment in the Louvre, whether it was in-house or external. And then when you're going through the streets of Paris, the busier it is, the easier it is to lose someone. They probably would have escaped by scooter and already had a plan to change vehicles. You've probably seen in movies some scooters going into a garage, driving up a makeshift ramp into the back of a van. You can do that in real life too. That's not hugely complicated. So changing vehicles, in trying to alter things like your height or build artificially, that's probably not even necessary, because by estimated height and build alone, if that's not going to tell people much, you need to get a good picture of someone's face. And so they would probably have been wearing masks or something that would interfere with facial recognition if it's caught on security footage.
2 other questions. So they knew where construction was. More importantly, they knew that CCTV was not operating in that room. How likely do you think that was an inside job, or someone on the inside, or a former employee? Like, again, the 1911 Louvre was by a former employee of, 1911 Mona Lisa theft was a former employee of the Louvre. How likely is it in this case?
Well, there's something called hostile surveillance, which is the fancy term for casing the joint. When you go and check a place out and say, how would I commit a crime here? What are the security measures I need to circumvent? And so you don't necessarily need an insider to be aware of what is lacking. You can see quite clearly and in many cases intentionally so, when you visit a museum or a bank for that matter, you can see what security measures are in place. And there's two schools of thought related to this. One is, as the more traditional, that if you see security measures, you will be likely to choose another target with fewer security measures. But if you tell that to me, I would say it's much more disconcerting for criminals if they're engaged in hostile surveillance and they can't see anything. If all the security measures are concealed, because then they don't know what they're up against. They'll know this is a fancy museum that must be secured, but if they can't see it, then I think it's psychologically much more effective as a deterrent. And in this case, as far as I understand, it was visible what the security measures were. There may have been someone on the inside passing them information. It's entirely possible, but it's not necessary for them to pull off something like this.
And the reason they did it broad daylight, I assume, because, so one thing I read is that daylight, the security guards have to take care of the people. There's a lot of people there, and protect the artifacts. Nighttime, they only have one job, and that's protecting the artifacts. And if there's someone entering or going up on a cherry picker in the middle of the night, it's a lot easier to spot. Is that correct?
Yeah, so one of the things to keep in mind is the manner that they did this theft was really brilliant. So the idea is that if you see someone who looks suspicious, like if you see a ninja sneaking around the Louvre, you're going to call security. If you see someone in high visibility vests walking around with an alpha personality, like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, then it's not going to occur to you that they're up to no good. You're going to assume that they're doing what they should. And I mentioned this Swiss waiter, Stefan Breitweiser, who stole over 300 paintings. He stole every one by walking into the museum during opening hours, walking up to a painting, lifting it off the wall, and walking out. And he was so brazen and confident that nobody was suspicious until too late. And this is the same idea. So during opening hours, it's much more easy to penetrate a museum. It's locked down like Fort Knox at night. It's really tricky. But when it's open, they have to grant access to visitors. And it was just a stroke of brilliance to do something so incredibly obvious and like obtuse that nobody would think that they're doing something illegal until it's too late.
Yeah, I love your point. Like, I remember when I was younger, I would do it a lot as my little hack. I would walk into different places, like go into the VIP section of some festival, or walk into different areas I was not meant to be, or different rooms where there's an event. I was a lot younger. It works so extremely well, that confidence. People look at you and they see the confidence that you're meant to be there. It goes a long way. And I'm surprised you said there's that thief that kept stealing paintings time and time again. The way he was doing it was just walking in with confidence, picking up the painting and just walking out. Why do you think they were unarmed though? Because they used the cutting, the what do you call them? The cutting discs.
Disc cutters.
They used those to threaten. Yeah, exactly. They used those to threaten the security guards. That was a bit surprising to me. My question is, why didn't they have weapons, and why didn't the security guards have weapons? Have you thought of that?
Yeah, so it depends on the country you're in, but sometimes people are thinking ahead. If I get caught, how serious will my sentence be? And it's way more serious if you're armed than if you're not. Oh. So that may be something that people had in mind. Another thing that's interesting is there's a sort of gentlemanly tradition among art thieves, some of them, that this is an elegant crime that does not require weapons. And this dates back to one of the great art thieves, or I don't want to say art thieves because he only stole one work of art, but his name was Adam Worth. And Adam Worth is an interesting figure. If you ever read Sherlock Holmes stories, Professor Moriarty, the bad guy, was modeled on him. Adam Worth was the person who was first called the Napoleon of crime. And in 1876, he stole a Gainsborough painting. And he was in charge of his own international organized crime group in 19th century London. And he had this strict rule: no one who worked for him could carry weapons. They would just be stupid. They would be blunt instruments. They would stop thinking. He didn't want to escalate it that way. And there are some art thefts that I call blitz thefts that involve ramming into museums, waving weapons around, not caring if you set off the alarm because you're in and out faster than security can respond. But other than those, there's a lot of unarmed art thefts. And, part of it may be hedging your bets. If I get caught, I'm going to have a lower sentence because I'm not threatening people's lives. But the other thing is, if this is bold enough, then they wouldn't need it. And I think they were confident enough that they would be in and out before security could respond because they had such a strong first move.
What do you think they're doing now? So some people say they would just lay low and just to kind of avoid just for the kind of the attention to kind of calm down. The others were saying, no, they'll be dismantling the jury as quickly as possible, trying to leave Paris before investigators catch on to them.
I think what probably happened, unfortunately, is that within a few hours, all of the objects were broken up into component parts.
Oh, wow.
And then over time, they would be recut so that they were not directly identifiable as having come from the stolen objects. And then very slowly, they would be smuggled abroad and sold over the course of an extended period of time in many different locations. That would be my best guess. And that's probably what they're doing if they're being smart. If they're not being smart, there is one thing maybe to mention that may be happening behind the scenes, and it's not public knowledge, but there's a precedent where if authorities were to offer a reward for the return of all the objects intact that is higher than the value of chopping them up and selling the ingredients, then there's a chance that they might preserve them. And if we look back in 2008 at a museum at University of British Columbia, there was a theft that wasn't particularly high profile, but it shows a case in point. So some thieves broke into the Museum of Anthropology there and stole gold jewelry. And it was kind of cinematic. They used bear spray to cover the entrance of the museum when the one security guard went out for a cigarette break. So if he came back early, he would be knocked out by this bear spray. And they went in with gas masks and they took this gold jewelry. And the police put up a reward that was higher in value than if they melted down the gold jewelry and sold it. And as a result, they stayed the hand of the thieves. The thieves waited and said, is there a way we can get this reward? And they waited long enough that the police successfully intervened and arrested the bad guys and got all of the works back. So that is the only roadmap that, they may have done that and we just don't know about it. But otherwise, it's unlikely that the thieves would wait to try to get a reward or to sell the objects as they are.
Yeah, I was surprised. Why didn't the Louvre put out a public reward for the thieves and maybe some sort of deal, maybe a shorter sentence? Because then they'd save the jury. And they'd be able to get the jury and they'd still be able to apprehend the thieves. The thieves like, hey, you'll get a maximum of, because when I searched it, they could get 10 to 20 years in jail. Say, look, you'll only get 5 years or 3 years if you turn the jury and we'll pay you X amount. Is that not to incentivize other thieves to do the same?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And in some countries, it's illegal to do that. It depends on the laws of the country in question. For instance, in England, it's illegal to pay a ransom for a person who's kidnapped or an object anyway. So it depends on the laws of the country, and also it's a disincentive. Just to give you another example, in Italy, there was a theft of paintings from one museum. A reward was paid for their return. The thieves returned them through a colleague, and then they stole the exact same paintings again. This is what you don't want to have happen. It's not recommended, unfortunately.
I didn't know this world existed. I thought this was just in movies.
Oh, yeah.
I thought
Man, I got loads of good stories.
It's not possible
for
anymore.
You. Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
The only reason this got so much attention is because how brazen it was, and it was the Louvre. So it got a lot more attention. But it seems there's Ocean's 11's events happening on a regular basis. By the looks of it.
Believe it or not, there are tens of thousands of art thefts reported every year worldwide. Tens of thousands, and many more go unreported. But we tend to only notice the couple of cinematic ones that capture our attention each year, and we assume that that's it. But this is happening all the time, which is why I'm not always paying attention. I need my mom to send me a message when there's a big one, because there's too many coming in for me to keep track of everything.
So you think they're still in France?
I would guess that they're still in France at this point, that the jewels have all been cut up, and then they're slowly going to distribute them and sell them in a number of countries over a period of months. That would be my best guess.
Okay. And then what about the investigators? So I heard that the same investigators that investigated the theft of Kim Kardashian's jewelry are involved here, the same investigation team. I've also seen that they've hired an Israeli intelligence company or security company to help them out. That company dealt with the big theft that happened in Dresden. Mm-hmm. And Interpol could also get involved. Can you give us an overview on how significant are those investigators, the security company, Israeli security one? And by the way, I didn't know there was a theft in Dresden of $130 million. It's also mind-boggling. And the investigators of Kim Kardashian. And how big of a role would Interpol play if they do get involved?
So Interpol, you have to understand, is quite different from it is in the movies. There's no such thing as an Interpol agent who actually chases bad guys. Interpol is a data and coordination organization that basically takes all of the world police and coordinates their activities. So Interpol is going to be involved with anything related to organized crime and that's transnational. And they have a stolen works of art department. This is both the work of art and jewelry, so it crosses those boundaries. Who investigates is only important in terms of their connections. So almost all thefts are solved, if they're solved, through police paying criminals to rat out other criminals. All the world's police organizations keep criminals basically on a payroll in exchange for passing them information about what other criminals are gossiping about. And because criminals think it's sexy to steal art and jewels, they're likely to brag about it. And that bragging, if somebody doesn't brag about it, they're very unlikely to be caught. But it's hard to do that because, just like if you win a football match, you're going to want to tell all your friends when you go out to the pub later on, and that there's a criminal equivalent to that. So this paid informant system is what's most important. And so you just need to have agents who are linked to either police or intelligence services or have their own paid informant system. And then you have a better chance. You just have to have your ear to the grindstone. It's one of the reasons that a Hercule Poirot or someone like me as a historian of art crime, I could never solve a crime because I don't know enough criminals. And the ones who are actually solving them, you have to know the criminals enough to be paying them or for them to trust you to pass on information. And that's the only real chance of finding out who is behind this.
How likely do you think they are to be caught?
They'd have to be pretty dumb and make a brash move to be caught because they're in a very good position. They did, as I said, without condoning it, they did very well so far. And as long as they don't stick their heads out and try to get greedy, or as long as they're quiet about what they did and don't tell anybody else, then it's pretty unlikely that they would be caught.
The last question I have is they did drop a lot of items. Won't those items have their DNA so they could trace those DNA?
Yeah,
would those items help in any way?
That's always possible, especially since they were trying to burn some of it on their way out and failed to do so.
What do you think of that? What do you think of that as well? The fact that they tried to burn the cherry picker and they couldn't.
I think that part of it may not have been planned as well, or they were interrupted by security forces sooner than they might have hoped. But these things can go wrong. It's just like if you're playing a football match, your manager writes up your tactics, but it might not always go the way you want it to. But it is possible that they will find DNA on what was abandoned. But if they were smart, they would be, double bagging, wearing latex gloves under their other gloves. There are various ways to keep as clean as possible. And unfortunately, it's probable that they did.
They also dropped the crown. Did that surprise you?
Yeah. That can happen too. Best laid plans. They got away with was it 8 or 9 objects? They left one behind. I think they're still thinking it's a job well done. If you work one day and you make 10 million, you're not going to be kicking yourself that you didn't make 100 million because now you have a template to do this again, unfortunately. And the hope is that museums will be a bit more vigilant. The problem with museums is you can go years and years without a single incident of someone actually trying to steal something. So human nature is, your brain switches off if your job hasn't been to actually catch a bad guy for many years. And so the best museum security directors will run what are called like red team exercises, where someone who works for the museum is trying to basically pretend to break in to keep staff on their toes. But still, this is the kind of thing where it's not the kind of job where you're constantly vigilant, because most of the time there's nothing to be vigilant about except some kid who's going to accidentally lick a painting or something like that. So it's hopefully people will get a little bit, take it a little bit more seriously and make sure that this type of crime can't happen again.
I think now we're going to have you on the show again because a lot of people will be paying attention. So next time there's a crime, even a smaller one that usually would be ignored, we'll get the press very quickly because of what happened in Louvre. And if we do have some developments on this heist, I'd love to have you again to discuss it.
Thanks. It's been great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Noah. Have a good day, sir.